Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, we're sharing a recent chat with Andrew Lee, author of the book Defying Displacement, Urban Recomposition and Social War, released by AK Press on February 6th of 2024. Andrew and I talk about gentrification, speculation and financialization of housing, the destruction of communities by racial capitalism in the state, and some methods used to fight back and stay put. Andrew shouts out Decolonize Philly as a project to pay attention to. Hope you enjoy. So I'm joined by Andrew Lee, author of the book Defying Displacement, Urban Recomposition and Social War, which will be out from AK Press on February 6, 2024. Congrats on the book, and thank you for joining me for the chat. Would you mind telling us your correct gender pronouns, location, or other information that the audience might find helpful to know you?
Sure. My name's Andrew. I use he, him pronouns. I live and organize in Philly. And used to live and organize in San Jose in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Can you talk a bit about what got you writing and thinking and fighting around issues of displacement?
This book really came out of my work in grassroots movements against displacement, which I've been involved with alongside other folks for several years now. And I think that there are these movements against gentrification that are really taking center stage in movement spaces in cities, not only across the country, but around the world. This is a huge social process, this transformation of urban areas and the expulsion of the remnants of the urban working class of color. And I started thinking about the issues that I raised in this book and tried to dig deeper into the social process behind gentrification. Because I think that there's something really novel happening in contemporary capitalism that these movements are grappling directly with. And I think there are a few reasons why it can be hard to see what's new in this process. Because gentrification, it depends on exploitation and income inequality, which is very old, white supremacy and racism, which is also very old. And of course, displacement itself isn't new. And the communities that are getting displaced with gentrification today have suffered double or triple displacements before, because these are communities of color. These are ethnic enclaves of folks who were displaced through slavery, through genocide, through imperialist wars, have landed in these urban communities, and now they're getting displaced once again. So none of these things are new, and it can look like it's just more of the same, which from one perspective it is. But what is interesting about gentrification is that we're in a new period, especially in the United States, where pricing out working class people from cities is profitable for the richest people and institutions. And that is something that we haven't seen before. And it's leading to a wholesale transformation of the composition of cities based on a transformation in the way that value is captured in contemporary capitalism.
I like how your book, while bringing in stories of people's experiences of having their communities ripped apart by capitalist processes, you also go into, I guess, a systematic approach to gentrification, because I've definitely lived in communities where I'm going to give the same examples of like where gentrification is the white punk household or the artists moving in down the street, or where people point to the specific business that moves in that is the gentrification, or rightly pointing to increased policing that occurs as white folks move in, or as specialty businesses move into a neighborhood, but saying that it's not just those things, that those are kind of harbingers, I guess. Anyway, gentrification feels like a messy thing to talk about. And so I wonder if you could kind of break down what the process in your understanding of gentrification is, particularly in the current tech reinvestment in cities and redisplacement of communities of color.
It does. So those two examples that are very common, like exemplars of gentrification in a lot of discourse, like the white punk house and the like hipster bakery, like those are part of the process of gentrification. But if that's where our analysis ends, we lose so much, and we lose really important opportunities to actually understand and combat this much broader social process. A lot of our discourse about gentrification is from the perspective of someone who may or may not be a gentrifier. Like, I moved to this neighborhood. Am I a gentrifier? If I am a person of color, or if I'm queer, or if I grew up in a similar neighborhood. And that's sort of where our thinking about gentrification starts and stops in a lot of narratives and conversations. And what that does is it limits the anti-gentrification fight to like the feelings of a potential gentrifier. And then it's just about someone's, guilt or lack of guilt. And what we're really talking about is ethical consumerism, right? It's about, where is it ethical for me to consume a unit of housing? Just like, is it more ethical for me to consume, this product from a co-op as opposed to Walmart? And like, of course, those things in both of those cases are significant, but we know that if our political analysis ends there, it's self-defeating, because it remains within the confines of market decisions, and it doesn't allow us to tackle the broader structures within which people are making consumer choices. I think part of this is gentrification can be a really loosely defined word. And sometimes people use it to just mean an improvement in a neighborhood, like a capital improvement in a neighborhood. And from that, you have people writing think pieces about, oh, is gentrification good or bad? Can you have gentrification without displacement? And I think that's just muddying the waters, right? If you have an affluent community of well-off homeowners who improve their properties all at once, or get new streetlights, or have the sidewalk replaced, no one calls that gentrification. Gentrification isn't just like physical improvements to a neighborhood. It is displacement. Gentrification is inherently about displacement. And it's about displacement for profit. Like, the communities that are getting gentrified a generation or two ago were largely working in manufacturing, assembly, here in Philly, textiles. So the people who, you couldn't own a factory or a sweatshop if you don't pay your workers enough to live next to it, right? It doesn't mean that these communities were paradises. It doesn't mean they weren't severely disinvested and repressed in a very intentional process, starting from the federal government over the course of decades. But there was a financial incentive for the capitalist class to have those workers there so they can go to work. And those jobs and those industries no longer exist. The industries that exist in urban cores today, in the United States, but around the world, are tech, biotech, finance, real estate, the universities, the elite universities that train people to work in those fields, the tourist developments to entertain those same class of folks when they're on vacation. And these are industries, right? Tech, finance, real estate, that don't require huge quantities of workers like assembly lines did. So you have a small section of workers and owners who are getting paid enough to gentrify, and people who would have composed the urban working class are now paid so little that their neighborhoods are gentrifiable.
There are significant portions of the book with focus on failed approaches to resolve displacement from a community standpoint. such as approaches to paragovernmental preservation, such as through UNESCO, voting in progressive politicians to city council, requirements on certain percentages of quote affordable housing units unquote per development, or reliance on the goodwill of NGOs or nonprofits to keep development or redevelopment within some limit, some sort of like reasonable rate that doesn't threaten the integrity of community. I wonder if you could talk about some of these approaches. I mean, if we're saying that like capital and the people that administer capital, obviously it's under the guise of a quote unquote free market, but there are governmental agencies and nonprofits and such that help to define the goals of capital development and profitability that decide what a neighborhood should look like, and partially based, as you say, on what the needs of accumulation of capital through workers like are in an area. I wonder if you could talk about some of these approaches towards resolving the development of neighborhoods and the displacement of communities.
There are so many interventions from politicians, from NGOs, from gentrifying corporations and universities themselves that operate as if gentrification were an automatic natural process outside of human control that we're just trying to respond to. Like it's an earthquake. Like the earthquake happened, it's nobody's fault. There's going to be more earthquakes in the future. All we can do is pitch in and try to remedy the effects and prepare better for the next one. And that is not what gentrification is at all. And if you look at what these people are saying to one another, a very different picture emerges. So people who are involved in urban planning, municipal policies, those sort of fields, you have like a positive and a negative example for what you want your city to look like. Like the negative example is post-Great Recession Detroit, right? Capital flight, white flight, decreasing population. There's no money to do anything. We all, as local political elites, would hate for that to be our city, right? The positive example is a place like Austin or Silicon Valley or San Francisco, where you have all of these very rich corporations. There's a lot of investment. People are flocking to them. And so a lot of urban planning is about how to engineer your city so it's more like San Jose than Detroit. And the thing that is important here is that San Jose is also a post-industrial city, just like a Detroit. San Jose used to have microchip factories before they were outsourced. So the area urbanized for microchip assembly line workers. All those jobs disappeared. The only reason why that area didn't have the same issues as post-Great Recession Detroit is because tech R&D and investment took over the area, which is to say the difference is gentrification. The difference is these corporations that are attracting highly paid workers and expelling everyone else. Gentrification is a positive policy outcome that is highly desirable to state and financial elites. Gentrification is something that is sought after and constructed by the state. And it's one of the chief things that local elites are looking to inspire, because that's the economic configuration in which we're in. The industries that can capture the most value are the ones that are paying this relatively small section of the working class enough to gentrify. So any of these interventions that are predicated on the idea that, displacement it's just happening and we're all doing our best to take care of it, they're lies. They're built on lies. And maybe not all of these people have the intellectual honesty to admit to themselves what they're doing, but they are aiming to create gentrification. They are actively creating gentrification through tax avoidance, through zoning, through all sorts of mechanisms. But local municipal elites are desperately looking for gentrification. The corporations that want to create hubs of their educated workers, which is what the San Francisco Bay Area provides for tech firms, right? People go there and you can work at different tech firms. You can work at a startup. You can work at a big five like Google. You can bounce around. There's an educated workforce with the required skills. There's coding boot camps to feed people into that. There's, the venture capital firms. So you can go talk to someone in person, and you have the conversion of more and more of these cities into areas that are designed to be appealing for this type of worker. So that's where you get, the coffee shop, the yoga studio, all of that. That's a good job perk, right? If I move to the city to work for this company, I get to, go out to this commercial district with my millionaire friends. So for the companies that are creating gentrification, it's also a positive outcome that their financial growth depends on. If gentrification didn't happen, they would have to pay their workers more to absorb those housing costs. So it could. I also think a lot of fights around displacement, because it is so produced by the state, a lot of local movements, have to engage with municipal politics, or at least affected by municipal politics on some level. And I understand that there have been, local politicians who take better or worse stances in regards to public pressure from the outside. And, I'm not one to, write off a movement because they decide to, ask a politician to not ethnic cleanse them quite so fast, right? That's not really, I think, my place. But I do think that there are limitations if we're looking at electoral politics at the local level as the thing that will stop displacement, that will end gentrification. I think that there needs to be an extra political, extra legal force for two reasons. First, like I said, this is the way to run a functional city government under what has been called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the knowledge economy, the new economy, what I argue could just as easily be called the gentrification economy. Cities that don't gentrify don't have money. Cities that do gentrify do. If you are a politician of any stripe, the rational thing for you to do over the long term is to support gentrification, right? So if we're going to try to push outside that, which I think we must, I think that there's real limitations about, depending on like a council member to try to stem that tide. The other thing about gentrification is the people who are most negatively affected by gentrification are, of course, the people who get displaced. And if we're talking about local municipal government, that means that they aren't that politician's constituents anymore. The people who benefit the most from gentrification are new arrivals. Those are the people who become that politician's constituent. And we also know that participation in voting correlates with wealth and education level. So the people who are moving in are already more inclined to waste their time voting than the people who are getting pushed out. So I think just because of the structure of like what local government is, and the fact that gentrification involves getting removed from a local area, they're getting new constituents. That's what this process is. They're getting new constituents who are the beneficiaries of displacement, the people who were attacked by these political decisions. There's no longer any mechanism for accountability.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what displacement looks like. There's the examples of like obviously that somebody experienced in their household or in their neighborhood of increasing cost of living, decreasing availability of employment, increasing policing, these sorts of things. But I think that it's kind of interesting to look at shifts, at least in how I understand, in the way that the populations have been moved around by racial capitalism. So looking at, say, back in the post World War II era, folks had moved in a lot of cases to where jobs were, or where relatives, friends, or other community were, around job centers, around factories. As deindustrialization occurs, white flight occurs, right? A lot of white middle and upper class folks move out of the cities into the suburbs, which brings a lot of the tax base with it. Industries simultaneously are moving factories to less urban, less unionized areas, and then eventually out of the country in a lot of cases. And there's some like global dynamics to this. It's not just about those specific factory owners. And then we see this process now that communities that had been existing, like a lot of them racialized communities that had been living for generations in metropolitan cores, being forced out over the last few decades through redevelopment, including nonprofits and capital working with government to use eminent domain to break down pre-existing communities, black and brown communities to a large degree, so as to remake pockets to reinvite capital and some of those white communities that have moved out to the suburbs back in, pushing a lot of people out to the cores. So you have like a disinvestment in suburbs that now have like large communities of people of color as capital moves back into the inner cities. Is that like a fair breakdown of like how that dynamic kind of looks from a wider scale, or am I missing some pieces?
Yes, I think that's right. And I really want to hone in on the role of race here. When we look at investment in a neighborhood, reinvestment, incentivized gentrification, what makes, if I'm an investor, right, I want to invest in a property that's going to grow in value the most, obviously. It's what geographer Neil Smith calls the rent gap, right? The current value of a property, the gap between that and what its future value could be. So neighborhoods with particularly low current values represent the largest potential growth. That's why, middle class neighborhoods aren't gentrifying. One of the largest determinants of land value in the United States is race. An equivalent house and an equivalent neighborhood, same conditions, same upkeep, same number of bedrooms. If one of those identical houses is in a white neighborhood and the other house is in an equivalent in every other way black neighborhood, the white house is valued at $48,000 more than the house in the black neighborhood. So let's think about displacement. If I'm investing in a black neighborhood, the only thing that would have to happen for me to see a $48,000 profit on my investment would be not new businesses coming in, although that's obviously an incentive, right? Not the streets getting fixed, not any sort of, not a new bus line, nothing other than the changing racial composition of the neighborhood. If I can just get the tenants and all of their neighbors to be people of a different race, I make $48,000. So gentrification in the United States is deeply tied in to race and white supremacy, and it's tied in ways that go beyond the personal prejudices of like an individual gentrifier, because of the deep racism in US society expressed in the housing market. There's a quote unquote rational incentive for race-based displacement. Even if you as an investor, you personally, right, maybe you aren't bigoted. If the only thing you cared about would be making as much money as possible, and you had absolutely no thoughts about racial discrimination or anything. The thing you would do rationally, just for your own pocketbook, would be to invest in racial displacement. So I think that's a huge component of displacement, and it's one of the things that makes displacement so painful and damaging. Is these are communities where, despite repression, despite disinvestment, different communities, Black, brown, and immigrant communities, have carved out a little space where they can have community, where they can have history, where they can have, mutual recognition. And when those places get destroyed, there's no plan B. Like, I'm part of the campaign in solidarity with the folks who live in Philadelphia's Chinatown to stop them from getting displaced by a proposed basketball arena. And what I tell people is, like, there's no plan B for Chinatown. And Chinatowns across the country have gotten obliterated by redevelopment in the last few decades. There's no like second tier, slightly worse backup Chinatown that people are going to move to. If it's gone, at least for the foreseeable future, it's gone. And those communities get dispersed. And maybe there's like pockets of folks in different places, certainly less dense, certainly less connected, certainly less history, but the community itself is destroyed. So the streets are going to stay there. Maybe some of the buildings are going to stay there, but the actual flesh and blood people who make an area a neighborhood, that neighborhood, for all intents and purposes, ceases to exist. That's, I think, one of the most challenging things about gentrification, about thinking through it, is like the communities that we are in are what give us our social identity, right? No matter what kind of community, subculture, cultural group, like, we all want that, right? A place where we can be recognized for who we are, where we can recognize other people, where we can, express our full, social identities to people who will accept them with respect, right? Everyone wants that. Those spaces are what is getting destroyed by the process of gentrification, by the intersection of racial capitalism, the financialization of the housing market, and this, new economy of large firms and universities trying to colonize inner city areas for capital accumulation. And still, we have people saying that gentrification could be good. There are people writing reports saying that gentrification does not exist. That it's like that, there's maybe like, two places in the country where it's happening, but it's like it's very rare. It's inconsequential. These are untrue. These are untrue. And the problem is, there's so little research being done, tracking the number of people who get displaced from these communities, that you have people talking about the supposedly objective information, like, oh, the tax base is growing, the streets have more lights, the average income has gone up, all these supposedly objective universal facts against what gets framed as the sort of misguided, selfish interests of a specific community in not getting wiped off the face of the earth.
Yeah, and the example of like the income levels are higher, the like buying potential, the tax base, whatever. These are the people that you're describing, or you described before, as the replacement people. These are the new constituents. These are not, it's not about bringing up the people that were already living in the community. And it's good to remind folks that like that property ownership is one of the fundamental ways for intergenerational transfer of wealth, for accumulation of wealth, and for it to be passed down through people's families and thus through people's communities. And so when there are systematic approaches towards divesting people, whether it be through the sort of shenanigans that brought about the economic collapse in 2008 by focusing subprime mortgages towards Black and brown consumers, or the deployment of eminent domain by cities and redevelopment agencies. Like, this is a fundamental outcome of it, is the continued disinvestment of already systematized, like racialized and indigent communities or working class communities, right?
Yes.
What sorts of models of resistance to displacement have you seen successful in your work and study on the subject? And what could success mean in this instance where the market economy continues to exist with the government backing it?
Yeah. So there are so many communities around the world that are trying to grapple with this very question right now of what successful resistance to displacement looks like, of what victory really looks like for our communities. I think we're in a place that might be, analogous to that the workers' movement was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? Where there were a lot of folks, there was a lot of spontaneous factory occupations, walkouts, union activity, and people were filling out how to build out, structures and theories around that because they saw that these struggles brought them directly into conflict with the most powerful forces in their global economy. With so many workers today work in a very fragmented labor market. People work at small businesses, you work at mom and pops, you work as an independent contractor, you work in the informal economy. It's no longer, me and a couple thousand of my closest friends at the, the Manchester factories. So when a lot of these struggles kick off, you aren't actually fighting the capitalist class, and a lot of times they just go out of business. The people who are being put into confrontation with the, to use a term of art, commanding heights of the contemporary economy are movements against displacement. I think that we can defeat these developments today. I think we have seen ample evidence that that is difficult but possible. I think that ultimately, moving forward, the horizon that we're building towards has to confront the housing market, or more precisely, the market in land. Because it's not that buildings are being overvalued and speculated, it's the land they're sitting on that's being the target of financial speculation. So models like occupations, squats, community land trusts are all ways of affecting the decommoditization of land in the near term, effectively taking land and removing it from the private market by ensuring that it will remain under community control or in trust indefinitely, regardless of changes in use or occupancy. So I think that's one thing that we can look towards today. I think we're building this out. I think one thing that I keep coming back to is, how interconnected all of these fights are. Because again, it's like we're talking about like a relatively small crew of like very, very rich dudes who are at the tops of the same investment banks and real estate holding companies and tech firms and universities. So people who are in very different cities fighting displacement often end up fighting folks who are either connected or the literal same. And we don't really have a model yet for what inter-city, intercommunal solidarity looks like. I think our models for that are either, around models we got from the Wars of National Liberation, around national solidarity, or models that we got from the Third Industrial Revolution around worker solidarity. And I don't know if we have that model yet for residents and neighborhoods fighting displacement to work in ways that are strategic and aligned and build class power. But I hope that that's where we're getting towards. But I think ultimately, like, we need to confront the housing market, the market and land, as the cause and reservoir of so much dispossession and displacement historically, but particularly in the present day. Even in a market economy, there's all sorts of things you don't have a legal market for. love, heroin, people, nuclear bombs. Since we all need a place of land to stand upon, since we all should have a place to call our home, should land be a thing that is bought and sold? And how can we orient our movements today to reclaim more and more territory so that we can have a place in the world?
Hey, listeners, I'll try to keep this short and sweet. We've got some upcoming conversations that I'm excited to be working on, including a conversation with counter-surveillance project NoTrace.how, another with philosopher and anti-fascist Joan Braun, about people leaving the fascist movement and problems with the framework of de-radicalization, as well as a conversation with incarcerated anarchist prisoner in the UK, Toby Schoen, alongside of others. Weekly, we work to bring you and our wider audience, including those over the airwaves, conversations that you won't hear many other places. And we operate at a minimum cost, paying for transcription, printing, mailing, web hosting to make sure that the information is easier to translate and accessible, including to our comrades who are behind bars. The most regular way that we fund it is from the Patreon. Our Patreon is currently below supporting our monthly operating costs of around $500, so I'm asking folks on the fence about supporting the project who have a Patreon account to kick in and help at $3 or more a month. And you get some nice little presents and plus a good little warm feeling in your heart. If you don't have a Patreon, we do have a LiberaPay where you can pseudonymously kick us money occasionally or on a regular basis, or you can set up a recurring payment from PayPal. In addition, we take money via Venmo and Stripe. Or you can just send us an anonymous money order in our P.O. box, as some other people have kindly done. If you haven't supported us before, or haven't for a while now, and you can afford to, we'd really appreciate the help. Knowing that the money is going to be there next month makes me stress a lot less. And if you're already supporting us or have in the past in various ways, I just want to thank you. All right, on with the show. And not just find like a little corner to shove ourselves into, but actually get to thrive in a community with people for a long time. Of the like legalistic approaches that get talked about, and like land trusts being one where there is a legal framework that has been created for this model. We'll see how that stands up to things like eminent domain, or I mean, if the government, if the state and capital really want to break something like that, I'm sure they can, but it might just be a battle they haven't thought to fight yet. I haven't heard this brought up in the book, and we can skip this if you're not interested, but you did talk a bit about resistance to the Google campus in Berlin. When I had spoken to folks there a couple of years ago about housing issues, they had mentioned this model that's not dissimilar in some ways to the land trust model, but basically a collectively run corporation that will help people purchase flats from the market, but the corporation owns something like 51% of it, and the individual gets loans to purchase the house. They can pay off that 49%, so they own 49% of it. And if they sell it, it can't go back onto the market. It goes back into that collectively owned corporation so that it can be sold at or leased or whatever, I guess, at a decreased rate to other individuals seeking housing. But I don't know that much about that model. Like, that's how I recall it being described to me, and I think it was coming up against a bunch of government regulatory issues in Germany. Have you heard of that, or any other sort of like novel approaches towards, at least for the short term, like collectivizing and demarketizing property?
Yeah, I think I haven't heard of that specifically. It sounds pretty similar to how community land trusts work in the US in practice. And I think like nothing is a silver bullet. I mean, the problem with land trusts is you still have to acquire properties, just like that co-op model in Germany. So if you're in a gentrifying city, market rate housing is, of course, the whole problem. So sometimes it's like you force someone to give it to you. You have like a campaign to acquire land. And in the absence of that, like you're looking for grant funders to acquire market rate housing. So I mean, I think that there's obviously challenges with everything, especially because, as I've said, gentrification is such a highly desirable outcome for the most powerful people on the planet. But there's so many opportunities in the fact that it is the wealthiest, most powerful people on the planet who have a vested interest in urban displacement. I think that there's a lot of power that can come out of demands that may seem very modest, but if you really work through them, require significant structural transformations. I think there's a lot of like narrative and like organizing power in that framing. This is what Andre Gorz called non-reformist reforms. And a lot of people use that term in like electoralist, democratic, socialist spaces. And unfortunately, none of them know what it actually means. The people use it to talk about things like Medicare for all and use it to mean like a pretty big reform. Like if a small reform is a normal reform, then like a pretty big substantial reform is like a non-reformist reform. Like if we're at 0 and like adjusting the tax rate by 1% is like a 5, and socialism is at 100, then anything that within the 40 to 60 range is like a non-reformist reform. And that's actually not the sense in which Gorz used the term at all. And funnily enough, in his book, actually mocks the idea that making healthcare more accessible could be called a non-reformist reform. So that's pretty cool. But what he means is not a reform that's like very substantial or like halfway to a large change. It means a reform that seems to be directed at the state, like a thing that you're asking the state for. But if you're actually serious about it, it has to be, the only way to accomplish it is by overturning state power and developing the class power of the oppressed. I think there are a lot of radical social movements that have come out of things like this. What could be a more modest reform than I want to feel safe walking home at night, just like men do? And then if you start working on it, you're like, and that's why we have to abolish gender. Or like, I don't think that there should be, structural inequalities left over from literal slavery, and Black men shouldn't be murdered by the police with impunity. I guess we have to abolish America, right? Because these things are so deep, that's something that seems like a very non-crazy normal thing to ask for, because these forms of oppression are so deeply rooted and so powerful. It would require deeply uprooting them. What could be a more modest demand than I want to stay in my house? I want to stay in my house and I want to keep paying rent to my landlord at the same amount that I do today. I mean, it's not even a reform. It's literally conservative because you're asking for things to stay the same. What could be more reasonable than that? Who could possibly object to that legitimately very modest, very reasonable preference? But because there is so much money in the obliteration and removal of certain communities, it would require attacking the foundations of the private housing market in this country to stop this over the long term, for the next generation, for the generation after that, to move beyond the campaign we might be working on today or tomorrow to actually get a lasting security and victory for our communities, would require moving large swaths of land out of market control. And I think that there is a lot of power in that connection that's being articulated very powerfully by so many of these movements against gentrification.
Thank you. I'm curious about the use of the term social war in the title. Can you talk a bit about what it's doing there? Maybe why you feel that a more recognized term like class war wouldn't have sufficed, and how you view the composition of antagonists in the struggle around displacement?
Yeah, I think I mean class war. But I also think people, I think that term has a lot of baggage, some of which I argue against in the book. I think that there is a sense in which class war is used by some radicals and it to mean something like, and then one day we all come to work with our guns and we start the class war. And I think for a lot of folks outside certain milieus, that seems ridiculous, especially because we have the most heavily armed working class in human history in the United States, and we are not the closest anyone has ever been to revolution. But if you look at the history of the term class war, it comes from an early translation of the Communist Manifesto into English. And just a brief aside here. So the early translations of the Communist Manifesto are a gold mine for wonderful stuff. The line that's like a specter, the specter of communism is haunting Europe, was originally translated the hobgoblin of communism is
Ooh.
haunting Europe. Yeah, the hobgoblin, like a little troll. It's like, ha ha ha, I'm going to abolish the value form. So that rocks. But the class war was the first translation of the line that's like all of hitherto existing human history is the history of class struggle or class war. So class war in that sense isn't about something that we're like advocating for. It's not like, oh, like today there's no class war, but if I have enough radical reading groups, maybe there will be one next year. Class war is an analysis. It's an analysis of the fundamental antagonism in class society, and it's a recognition that those class relations are maintained through force, including physical force. I think also, when some people talk about class in some senses, I think there's a lot of intellectual, ideological baggage that leads some white radicals to, I think, gloss over the centrality of race and white supremacy in U.S. class formation and society, and obscures some of the actual fractures and dividing lines when we're looking at class struggle in the gentrification economy. A lot of gentrifiers are workers, right? Like the San Francisco Bay Area is being gentrified not because every gentrifier owns like a startup, because most people are the highly paid employees of tech firms, people who work in software development, R&D. The idea that workers have a commonality of interests, and that commonality of interests is the most important component of the class struggle, and that class struggle has the potential to change the world through the expression of the universal demands, of the universal interests of the proletarian class. That wasn't just an idea that dropped down from heaven, right? When the thinkers of the revolutionary left were doing their thing, they were all of them in the middle of the third industrial revolution, right? The late 19th to early 20th century. And it's not like the Marxists and Bakunin's like thought of the idea of labor unions and then passed out enough pamphlets and workers were like, oh, cool, yeah, let's do that. Worker revolts were happening, and people who were conscious revolutionaries were trying to think through, support, and intervene in these struggles that were already happening as a result of urbanization and as the result of the concentration of pools of oppressed workers in the same workplaces in the richest cities of their day, right? That's where that came from. And it was the community of industrial workers taking collective action at the point of production, which was providing extreme strategic leverage that people were trying to recognize and think through. And that's where every left-wing ideology we have today came from. They were basically in they were the differences between um, forms of Leninist vanguardism and anarchism and social democracy. These are essentially strategic differences about how to establish urban hegemony given the actually existing class conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th century. Given that these things are happening, should we do propaganda of the deed? Should we form a vanguard party? Should we vote for a socialist mayor? But this is not the predominant fraction in the class struggle in the present day. The most, among the most conflictual relationships around class are about displacement and resistance to gentrification. And that's, I think, what we need to attend to and orient ourselves around when we're thinking of intervening and struggle and looking at workers' interests. Some people use the category of worker in a way that I think actually steers us away from looking at the material conditions and the possibility of struggle and the interest involved with different individuals, just by saying, oh, well, we're all workers. Sure, the undocumented farm workers harvesting crops and software engineer at Google making 6 figures 1 year out of college are both workers. Sure. The question is, do they have the same interests? And do they have a basis to fight aside one another? Whereas if I live in a gentrifying neighborhood as a member of a gentrifying community, maybe I have more interest with someone, who isn't my coworker but is my neighbor. Maybe in a limited sense, I have interests, in common with my employer, because I couldn't get a job speaking my language if my employer went out of business, and the noble proletarian employees of Microsoft moved in. So those are some of the reasons why I use the term social war, because I think it is about class, but I think we need to think about class in a more sophisticated way, where our ideological frameworks from a century ago aren't impeding our ability to identify and intervene in the class dynamics we're participating in and that are around us.
Yep, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. I guess ongoing with critiques of the ways that leftists and anarchists might engage with the issue. In the final chapter, Notes on Practice, you warn against leftist and anarchist formations in struggle and advise, quote, anarchism of praxis, unquote, as found among many communities already fighting displacement. I wonder what examples you can give about what you're warning against in these housing struggles, any specific tenants unions or other models that you feel have failed time and again, but been re-implemented for ideological reasons.
Yeah, I have been organizing in anarchist anti-authoritarian spaces for over a decade. If it weren't for these spaces, I wouldn't be who I am today. I also think we need to have a hard look at anarchism as it exists in the United States, especially in the context of white supremacy. I think that if you look at it historically, there were really 2 unconnected anarchisms in the United States. There was the anarchism in the early 20th century, which was predominantly Eastern European workers, up through the first Red Scare. So Berkman, Goldman, all those folks. It was a mass militant working class immigrant labor movement that folks came out of. And that movement was defeated. Some of its remnants moved into the CPUSA during the 30s. A lot of folks got deported. the FBI kind of won that one. Credit where credit's due. The anarchism of today, we can refer to the same folks. We can be like, oh, that essay was cool, but it's actually not a connected movement because that movement was cut off, and then a different movement coming out of predominantly white punk scenes emerged and looked back to those reference, right? There's like a publishing house or two bridging that gap, but like there isn't really a lot. So we actually have two different anarchist movements, and I think some of the subcultural features of US anarchism allowed it to survive to the present day, which is of course a valuable thing, but it's very different to have an anarchism coming out of white subcultural movements than of an anarchism coming out of a broad-based immigrant labor struggle. And I think that's what we need to grapple with. And I just think that if folks are conscious revolutionaries, if folks are anarchists, first of all, I think that you really should get involved in anti-displacement fights. I think it's some of the most impactful, exciting work that's happening, and some of the clearest fault lines that allow us to actually confront the top of the ruling class in the places where we live, to draw them out and to fight them. And I think that whenever we're doing work in community, we got to have humility. We got to have respect. We got to work with folks. And when I talk about the anarchism of praxis, I'm saying that for communities to resist displacement requires more than market mechanisms, right? It requires at least a healthy suspicion of politicians and, nonprofit foundations being like the silver bullet that will save you. So communities are doing a form of anarchism in that sense, no matter how folks would, identify their political beliefs, ideologically. I'm not saying that that means that, all of the politics coming out of any community are good, because they certainly aren't, but that for communities to have lived this long and to continue, especially into the future, requires a sort of anarchism of praxis, so that when we're engaging with folks, it's not about teaching people like Bakunin quotes or something. It's not about like bringing like a knowledge to communities that are in resistance. I think we're looking towards the forms of resistance and revolt and liberatory practice we can co-create based on the experiences and aspirations of communities in struggle. Anarchism, just like Leninism, democratic socialism, came from the Third Industrial Revolution, right? The idea that we're all going to form federated workplaces and then go out in the general strike, and that will be the revolution. Like, that is an idea that I think made sense in the late 19th century, when you had these huge concentrations of militant workers. But I think pointing to that as a sort of formula under the radically different material conditions we have today, I think is just as inappropriate as demanding some sort of fidelity to theories that were worked out in 1917 Russia, or early 20th century sewer socialism. I think that's what we need to repeat with our friends, with our neighbors, looking at the actual struggles that are existing today. How can we point ourselves towards emancipation, liberation, and abolition? I think that's the task that's in front of us.
Yeah, so get them corpses out of your mouth, yo.
Yeah, for real.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
say burn it down!
From Embers, anarchist perspectives from the territory currently occupied by the Canadian state. Find us wherever you get your podcasts or on the Channel Zero network.
But I wonder, like, I guess to kind of go, no, I think that those points are really well taken and expressed. You didn't talk about tenants unions in the book, and I don't know if that's just because that I saw, and I don't know if that's just because it's not a framework that you were working around through your work around displacement on both coasts, or if you had critiques of it. But I was kind of wondering if you, because this was like around the time of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, this was a way that people who were, taken out of the productive economy, to some degree subsidized maybe by big old daddy Trump dollars. God, I hate saying that. But, but like, people weren't in workplaces, and there were a lot of people obviously in workplaces, and a lot of people died in workplaces, and a lot of those people were working class people of color. But a lot of people were not in workplaces or found themselves interacting a lot more with the people that lived immediately around them. And there was a big crisis that the U.S. economy experienced where the leeching landlord classes needed to be subsidized in their leeching, I guess, so that part of the economy wouldn't collapse somehow, or they wouldn't revolt. And tenant unions seemed like an interesting intercession into that situation where a bunch of more federal money was getting plunged into the pockets of landlords to keep them from mass evicting people, and for people to call for like improvements, or improvements in their immediate situation, or to stop the losing of parts of their community and the eviction of their neighbors. Now, I don't know if you've worked with tenant unions or not, but I'd wonder what your take on that model is.
Yeah, I didn't really dive into it that much because it's not something that I have a lot of personal experience with, but I do have folks who work in tenants unions. I know that there have been real victories coming out of that model. I think, like all the things we're working with, I think in this stage of the anti-displacement fight, it's like we're trying to figure out what works, like what's going to be the most impactful against these like huge corporations and private equity firms and transnational institutions. I think, as someone who also has experience with the labor organizing, I think the big thing for housing or labor organizing in general is just, I don't know, take it serious. Like, take it serious, because otherwise you're just like messing around with people's lives. Like, it's one thing to be like, oh, come to this event, come to this protest. But if people are risking, eviction or termination, having good politics isn't enough. Like, you got to be in it to win it, and you got to be in it to support people, and you got to be in it to like show like real solidarity and not let folks hanging. And I think, I think that's for like any community work. But I think it just like, especially for stuff around people's homes, especially knowing, how hard it is once you have an eviction on your record, how hard it is to get stable housing after you haven't had it, how much folks are already dealing with. I just think people have to take it seriously and be prepared for the responsibility that taking that risk involves for them and for other folks. But I think tenants unions kind of like a moment with COVID. Yeah, I think that's an important component in figuring out how we're going to win this thing.
I mean, it's the point of reproduction or the point of production, like level of investment. If you're actually getting to know your neighbors, and this is your point of it, like where capital is extracting from you that you have in common with them. It also does seem to like provide an opportunity for. So I know that there are like wider networks of these tenants unions, and maybe a national network in the US, but also an opportunity to focus, like obviously residents of various properties that are owned by the same financial institutions in one city, let alone possibly in other states in the so-called US, could collaborate around policies within that corporation of how they deal with their tenants, how much like money they take beforehand, what sort of requirements they have on who can rent from them. Like, it seems like an opportunity for sort of bridging that geographic division. I mean, if people did it right, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the kind of configurations that could have a lot of promise. And I think the challenge is just like that, like for so much of stuff like that, we don't have models for that. I mean, until very recently, like one of the challenges with labor organizing is like most people had never heard of labor unions, right? Like huge swaths of the country just had no conception of what being in a labor union was. And now a lot of people have at least heard the word, right? They're familiar with the concept. They may not know what it looks like. They may not know what organizing one entails. They may not know what, being a member of a specific one would be like as a worker, but like people are familiar. And there is a level of legal protection for concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Board, right? It's not great. We all know that. But like there is a mechanism where you can get reinstated, you can get back pay, like your boss has to put up a stupid letter at least in the workplace, because you have some legal protections at organizing at work, and you don't have those or organizing to defend your home. Of course, the only reason we have those minimal legal protections at work is because people fought and bled and died for generations organizing at work, right? But I just say I think that's also something we're kind of on untested ground here. I mean, especially because these sort of institutional landlords like didn't exist 20 years ago. Like there wasn't a rental market for single family homes until the Great Recession wiped out 47% of Black household wealth and private equity firms stole a bunch of houses, right? Like it wasn't a commodity that existed, and now it does, right? There wasn't an equivalent to Blackstone, 50 years ago. We're talking about the scale we're talking about now. Like this is new. The financialization of real estate, which only means that like housing units are being traded as commodities, not just by like a landlord or your local like regional bank, but by these like transnational corporations. This is all very new. So I think that any sort of experimentation or attempts we can do to bring our struggles together, to bring our neighborhoods in struggle together, to support each other and have that strategic creativity as we try to figure out how to leverage the power that we have is important, is useful, is where we should be intervening. I think my only proviso is it's for real. We are talking about the survival or obliteration of communities, of parents and grandparents and children. We're talking about the ability of folks to hold on to their culture, to hold on to their social selves, to not die of exposure, to not be exposed to unrestricted police violence. We're talking about things for real flesh and blood people whose way of life is either going to be insured for the next generation or wiped from the face of the earth. So I think as we are trying to figure this out, I think we just need to understand the real human stakes in this because they are high.
Yeah. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. I'll let you go in a few moments, but I was wondering about the if we could go back to Philadelphia's Chinatown that you were discussing. Can you talk a bit about the struggles against the destruction of Chinatown by the building of this basketball stadium, and a bit about the Chinatown, its composition, who lives there, and some of what is feared would be lost if the stadium and the world that it brings would be built?
Yeah, I'm a member of No Arena in Chinatown Solidarity, NACS Philly on Instagram. We're a group of folks who ourselves predominantly don't live or work in Chinatown, who are working in solidarity with residents to protect the neighborhood and to stop a proposed basketball arena that we know would have catastrophic effects on the neighborhood. So Philadelphia's Chinatown, because it's located so close to the middle of the city, has been a target for displacement for many years. So there is a proposed basketball stadium, there's a proposed casino, there's a proposed jail. The community defeated all of those three proposals over the last several decades. So there's a lot of community knowledge and relationships around resistance, around community activism, and around neighborhood defense. A freeway was built through the middle of Chinatown. They were unable to defeat. And the owners of the Philadelphia 76ers are by day like billionaire real estate dudes. One of them is the CEO of a company called Campus Apartments. One of them is like senior director of strategic operations at Blackstone, the largest like renter in the on the planet, right? So like they're like fun like side hustle is owning the Sixers. So these are all guys who like stand to personally benefit from the displacement of Chinatown, and their narrative is, oh, you idiots, you big morons, we aren't going to build the arena on Chinatown. We're going to build it next to, directly adjacent to Chinatown. So everyone's going to be fine. That's what happened in DC. They built the Capital One Arena, again, not on top of, but directly adjacent to DC's Chinatown. Within 6 years, 90% of people got priced out. You go there today, there's the arch, there's like the signs are translated for like diversity or whatever, but there's no community. Like there's no Asian people in Chinatown anymore. So like that's what would happen. We saw what would happen. We are like a 2-hour drive from where the same thing happened. So we know exactly what would happen if this would come in, right? There would be such a great financial incentive for all of the land around a stadium to be acquired for businesses serving the arena, parking lots, hotels. It'd be very hard to access because of all the traffic. So like all the restaurants and businesses would die. We know exactly what would happen. This community has fought developments like this off many times before. So we are supporting folks with a lot of collective and intergenerational knowledge. And we're fighting people who are at a different scale of like capitalist devilry, like global finance capital shenanigans. So yeah, that's where we're at with the fight in Chinatown. The Philadelphia 76ers are trying to ignite a race war in Philadelphia. I never thought I'd be able to say that sentence, but it's true. They have this really slimy PR campaign where like after a year of opposition to the arena, they like had this big announcement where they're like, we're gonna have like 40% of the concessions vendors in the arena are gonna be Black owned because we love diversity, and the ethnic cleansing of Chinatown will be great for like racial justice. Philly's like 42% Black, so they're literally promising less underrepresentation. Also, they're the current owners of the Sixers. So if they really cared about this, which they didn't, they could have advocated for that at the arena where they currently play, right? So a very blatant attempt at race baiting because of the massive opposition to this arena. And one of the things that's really encouraging is how little that has worked. And I think people in our struggles, both to protect Black residents in West Philly in the people's townhomes, and the community in Chinatown, is that, you know, this is the same struggle. This is the same fight. These are two fronts in the multiracial movement against displacement and against gentrification, and that we are actively building and underlining those solidarities because that's how we're going to win. I think that because of the history of segregation, organizing between communities fighting displacement is often multiracial organizing if it is not intercity organizing. So being conscious about the work that's required to get into that and the strategic possibilities that open up for our collective liberation as we work through it, I think is very, very crucial and something that people, community leaders and organizers and fighters have put a lot of intention behind here in Philadelphia. And yeah, I think this fight is still ongoing. We've managed to, this fight is still ongoing. So if you're in the area, I would definitely encourage you to get involved.
Yeah, that's awesome. And like, I think the point is like pretty clear too, that communities that are trying to resist these displacements, like not that they've posited it this way, but like, it's not like a zero-sum situation. If some of the same assholes with a lot of money are like behind trying to put the Sixer Stadium in one place, and they're also like trying to displace housing in another neighborhood across town, it makes a lot of sense to take those names and focus collaboratively to fight against their ventures. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the People's Townhomes, the place where those are endangered, where those are based in and rooted in the community that lives there.
Yeah, so the People's Townhomes are in so-called University City, which was called the Black Bottom before it became targeted for intensive reinvestment and redevelopment by Drexel and the University of Pennsylvania in mid-century. So this is one of like the last large like concentrations of residents in the Black Bottom of like Black folks from West Philly. And they're trying to demolish them and create like a research center or something. There's a lot of like biomedical stuff in Philly at the universities. That's also a fight that's ongoing. I know that folks continue to be in conversation with decision makers. There was a long occupation in solidarity with them. There's been a lot of organizing coming out of the universities in solidarity with them as well. So many of those residents are just incredible leaders in movements in Philadelphia as a whole. And yeah, I think that and Chinatown are what the fights are today. But I mean, the thing about these anti-displacement fights in the stage of struggle where we're at today is that they're all sort of time limited, right? Either they build the arena or they don't build the arena. And in either case, the campaign is over. And I think we need to think about ways that we can develop folks, develop our capacities, develop our relationships in between fights so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. I mean, it's hard because either you live in a neighborhood or you don't, and you wouldn't want folks who don't live in a neighborhood calling the shots. But I do think there's power in like pulling together folks who can like work in solidarity with the folks living somewhere who are also interested in building movement infrastructure for the next fight. And for that to happen, it needs to be a movement that's self-aware, that's class conscious, and that can build power across communities and across these divides, because who knows what the next neighborhood that gets targeted for intensive capital reinvestment is, or what the characteristics are of the folks who live there.
And a helpful thing about your book was pointing out that in a lot of these communities that are resisting displacement, this isn't their first rodeo, even if the current generations aren't the ones who had fought against it. There's a long history of community organizing in different geographic locations and among lots of different populations to resist this sort of displacement, even if it looks a little different or the characters are different. Like with the various steps of displacement that have occurred in Black Bottom, like the renaming of the community, the expansion of the university into it. Even if the like one campaign ends and you have to swivel to another, oftentimes it's a lot of the same companies, I think, that are involved in the investment and the displacement. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'll link in the show notes to some of the projects that you've named. Are there any other projects or thinkers on the subject that you would want to direct listeners to? And I saw that you were doing at least one presentation on the book, and I'm not sure exactly when this will come out, but do you have a tour planned for it?
Working on tour stuff now. If you have any ideas of places I could go, please let me know, because I don't really know what I'm doing. But
Sure.
You can direct people to my website, xandrewleex.com. I have a mailing list up there. It's also my handle for IG and TikTok, so I'll put announcements there. Oh, I want to shout out Decolonize Philly at Decolonize Philly on IG. Keisha and Essence are doing really great work in terms of like building movement capacity, bringing movements together, bringing folks out of like the silos that we're in because of our like campaigns, and like building these like really productive spaces where folks across movements and across causes and communities can come together and orient their work towards land liberation in Philadelphia.
Cool. Thank you very much. And yeah, if I get any ideas, or if you have a thing in your head of like places you want to go, I can probably, I'm sure I won't have any resources other than what you could think of, but I'd be happy to help you think through those. But that's for off mic. But yeah, thanks again for having the conversation and for putting out this book. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
93 people in the U.S. were killed in mass shootings in the month of May 2023. That same month, 104 people were killed by cops, according to an incomplete list compiled by the Washington Post. These are their names: Johnny Karras, Frankie Lee Evans, Chase Abney, Lance Lockett, Jake Pawelek, Justin Michael Reffel, Everett Rand, Michael Roy Carney, Al Joseph Stenson, Edgar De Leon, Sergio Orduna Mata, Curtis Smith, Hunter Wesley Philip Faust, Hector Macias, Caitlin Marie Kohler. Name withheld, May 5th, McKinney, Texas. Mauricio Garcia. Name withheld, May 6th, Temperance, Michigan. Charles Lee Richardson. Ronnie Clark. Name withheld, May 7th, Plant City, Florida. James Rakeem Pierce. Name withheld, May 7th, Round Rock, Texas. Scott Neelan. Name withheld, May 8th, Tuba City, Arizona. Lee Anthony Cortez. Name withheld, May 8th, Southfield, Michigan. Matthew Guffey. Brian Christopher Burrow. Name withheld, May 8th, Burlington, North Carolina. Matthew Almanzar. Brandon L. Griffin. Albert Rafael Acosta. Robert Joseph Layton. Brandon LeMaine. Justin Roberts. Name withheld, May 12th, Canute, Oklahoma. David Wright. Carlos Manguia. John Earns. Michael Adams. Daniel Gutierrez. Michael Bryant Hayes. Tyler Andrew Thornton. Joseph Howard Upchurch. John McKenzie Jr. Kiera Nicole Howard. Cameron Malik McBurrow. Name withheld, May 15th, Meridian, Mississippi. Bo Wilson. Philip L. Dawson Jr. Daimar Lopez. Name withheld, May 16th, Kimberly, Idaho. Felicia Guzman. Robert Nash. Dakota Novotny, Pietro Lalicata, Trey Gore, Tyrone L. Payne, Cody Mercer, Raymond Matia, Sanchez de la Ferte, Prince Holmes. Name withheld, May 19th, Carson, Nevada. Travis L. Hammonds, Zachary Thomas Seward, David Gaylor, Andrew Drew Alexander Rodriguez, Tomas Ramirez Martinez, Sergio Milton Barrios, James Boyle. Name withheld, May 21st, Trinidad, Colorado. Bradley Beggins, Michael Craddock, Timothy Burgess. Name withheld, May 23rd, Sheridan, Arizona. Trevorius L. Stodgel, Lonnie Hendon, Anthony John Zaremski, Whitney Leanne Fox, Enrique Martinez, James Joseph Moriarty Jr., Sherry Lynn Vincent, Scott J. McDonald, James Harrison, Jose Angel Cruz, Christopher S. Swanger, Asia Fitzgerald, James Philip White Jr., Alex Richard McCallie Naom, Ruben Ramos, Jeremy D. Hagavold, Arturo Fuentes Jr., Israel Contreras Madigan, James Matthew Hooton, Robert Bob Anthony Diamond, Freddie Edwards, Jared Daniel Rudderham, Dylan Wilson, Kyle Whiting, Joshua James Wilson, Daniel William Mooneyham, Aaron Howard Fisher, Gideon Nathaniel Macon, Dmitry Alex Klimov. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.